many white Americans, particularly younger white Americans, to recognizing that policing is just the tip of a racist iceberg. That is, that beneath the policing are systems of educational inequality, because it's not just a question of pinning people into communities, but also pinning people in economically in terms of the educational opportunities that they get, in terms of the economic opportunities, and even in this current pandemic, in terms of environmental inequalities, the very air that people breathe and the way that that impacts people's ability to become sick as a result of the COVID crisis. But for the last 3.5 years, the Trump administration has tormented 700,000 young people who are Americans in everything but the actual citizenship papers they hold. And that level of cruelty, which was demonstrated at the border in terms of the mistreatment of young people trying to come to the United States, which has been demonstrated in the treatment of African Americans with regard to, from early on, the Trump administration essentially giving a green light to police brutality. So we've had 3.5 years of really an assault on people of color rhetorically and also in terms of policy. And then came the COVID crisis. And when I speak about the COVID crisis, I often say that it is the disease that revealed our fundamental illness as a society. The precarity of employment for so many people, the lack of assets, the racial wealth gap. That means that the average white family in the United States has $175,000 of net wealth, where the average Black and Latino family in the United States has an average wealth of between $18,000 and $21,000. Those are the most recent statistics. But what that means is that when a crisis breaks, you've got no choice to go back to work because you've got no wealth cushion on which to fall. And then, of course, the fragility of people in terms of their legal status, and in terms of people coming back from the criminal justice system, trying to find their toehold in labor markets. And it is not a coincidence, I think, that Rashard Brooks bolted from the police last Saturday night. That is the young man in Atlanta who was shot in the back as he was running away from a police encounter. This is a guy who was on probation, who was worried that the misstep of driving while intoxicated was going to remove him from being able to continue to be with his family and continue to work. So we've had the 3.5 years of the Trump administration. We've had the veil unlifted on fragility, marginalization, and vulnerability as a result of the COVID crisis. And when you look at the data that the good doctor was pointing to early on in this phone call, and you recognize the significant racial disparities in terms of Black and Latino folks in particular being much more vulnerable in terms of cases and in terms of deaths. Here in California, for the population 18 to 49, prime working age, 43% of that population is Latino. There are 73% of the deaths in that age category. 6% of that population is African American. There are 9% of the deaths in that age category. So that kind of recognition, that kind of bubbling recognition of racial inequality and racial disparity, into it steps the murder of George Floyd. And I feel like it's kind of broken open both communities to be able to speak for themselves, of course, in this crisis. There seem to be some noises today about trying to find another way to go ahead and deny DACA. But this is an incredible tribute to these young activists who changed the political calculus. Because frankly, I think what John Roberts is the most interested in, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, is the viability of the Supreme Court as an institution in touch with the sentiments of America. And I think that's part of the reason why he found a way to ruling in favor of DACA. I think the other thing that this has shown, there's about 74% approval for DACA becoming permanent. And that obviously is bipartisan and actually also quite, uh, you know, it's not just Latinos and Asians, but African Americans and whites and Native Americans whose numbers are often not shown in the polls who are supportive of this sort of a thing. And interestingly, in the last 3 years, the public uh, favorability in polling around immigrants has actually moved more in the favor of immigrants than it was at the start of the Trump administration. I think with the Trump and I've been really surprised, perhaps, that as Trump has tried to pull out all of the sort of racist dog whistles of the past about looters and law and order, it's just not working any longer. It's not working with young millennials of any racial group. It's not working with businesses. It's not even working with the NFL, where black athletes have forced the NFL commissioner to actually mimic their words and say that Black Lives Matter and talk about Colin Kaepernick needing to have access to employment. So I think something has kind of fundamentally broken open. And I think that the immigrant forces that were very patient in the first 2 years of the Obama administration are not going to be patient if Biden gets elected. They are going to insist that in the first year that this actually be a priority if indeed there is a new administration.